Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to systematically break down the history, the psychology, and the massive global impact of exactly why we buy the things we buy. It's a pretty wild ride, so let's just jump right in.
Okay, so I want you to picture a giant, overwhelming wall of CRT televisions glowing in a mall in Jakarta back in 2002. It's this dizzying visual of the sheer abundance of choices that completely defines our modern society. I mean, we see scenes exactly like this everywhere now, and it represents a huge, fundamental shift in how humanity actually operates.
Which immediately begs a really fascinating question. Why exactly are we so incredibly driven to purchase goods that go way, way beyond our basic survival needs? Think about it. For almost all of human history, scarcity was just the absolute norm. You survived. But today? Well, for a lot of us, the real problem is figuring out how to navigate an absolute ocean of excess.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that consumerism isn't just some simple economic transaction. No, it's a profound cultural evolution. It fundamentally shapes who we are. It's this phenomenon where we don't just buy things to survive anymore, we buy them for cultural, social, and identity-forming reasons. Now, what's super interesting is how fiercely divided the experts were on this behavior early on. Back in 1955, a Ford Motor Company executive basically said the consumer is the real boss, the ultimate winner of economic freedom. But then, fast forward just 5 years to 1960, and social critic Vance Packard argued the exact opposite. He warned that consumerism was this dangerous path of excessive materialism and wastefulness. And in this explainer, we're going to impartially look at the historical evidence that fuels both of these completely different perspectives. Here is our quick roadmap. First, the roots of consumer culture. Second, how we literally buy our individual identities. Third, the environmental toll of all this. And finally, we'll ask, are there any alternatives?
Part 1, the roots of consumer culture, from basic need to absolute desire.
You know, buying stuff just for the thrill of it isn't a completely modern invention. It actually kicked off with the 17th century expansion of the luxury goods trade. Think imported sugar and tobacco. Then, by the 18th century, businesses started figuring out how to market directly to the middle class. Fast forward to the turn of the 20th century, and the Industrial Revolution, along with the assembly line, kicked mass production into absolute overdrive. And finally, the 1950s hit. Commercial television exploded right into our living rooms, sparking a massive boom in durable goods as people started buying products specifically to boost their social status.
Let's look at some 18th century pottery, for instance. A savvy entrepreneur named Josiah Wedgwood cleverly marketed his beautiful, high-end goods to aristocrats first, and once the trend was set at the top, well, he turned around and sold it to the emerging middle classes who desperately wanted to emulate the wealthy. He basically invented modern status symbol marketing, proving that our urge to copy the people higher up on the social ladder goes way, way back. And by the turn of the 20th century, sociologist Thorstein Veblen actually coined a term for this: conspicuous consumption. He used it to describe this totally confounding human behavior, where people might literally go shivering in the cold just so they could afford an expensive status signaling coat. It's crazy, right? They'd sacrifice basic everyday necessities just to display an outward sign of wealth to everyone else. Moving on to part 2, buying our individual identities, or what's known as the commodity self. Let's pause and think about this for a second. Are you a Mac or a PC? Coke or Pepsi? Be honest, which side of those famous corporate rivalries do you personally identify with? Do you feel like deep down you're just fundamentally a Mac person?
Well, those rivalries perfectly illustrate this wild concept known as the commodity self. Media theorist Stuart Ewan actually coined this term back in 1976. He pointed out how corporations totally exploit our deep human need to feel like unique individuals. By choosing one nearly identical mass-produced product over another, we somehow feel like we are building our own unique personality. It's like corporations are literally selling us the very building blocks of our identities.
And this leads to a fascinating cultural loop called bricolage and counter-bricolage. Let's take Doc Martens. Step 1. They started out as just basic, cheap worker boots. Nothing special. But step 2, punk subcultures adopted them as a fierce symbol of rebellion. That's the process called bricolage. But here's where it gets wild. Step 3, corporate America noticed. Through counter-bricolage, they co-opted that rebellious cool factor, stripped away the original political meaning, and then sold those exact same boots back to the mainstream consumer at a massive premium. It is a brilliant, if slightly dizzying, cycle of cultural manipulation.
And today, this whole consumerist ideology has gone totally global. Everyday consumers across the world are endlessly striving to emulate the lifestyles of the wealthy. Just imagine a bustling, neon-lit commercial center in China, which is currently the world's fastest-growing consumer market. The overwhelming desire to jump into this global consumer culture is literally reshaping urban landscapes all around the planet.
But that brings us to part 3, the environmental toll and our planetary limits.
Because, unfortunately, the physical limits of this massive global system are pretty shocking. To put it in perspective, data from the Sierra Club shows that the United States houses less than 5% of the world's population, yet it draws down 19% of the world's copper, a quarter of its oil, and a staggering 33% of its paper. These are the raw materials going into our phones, our cars, and all those delivery boxes piling up on our porches. It is a wildly disproportionate draw on the Earth's very finite resources.
And that leads straight into a stark reality highlighted by biologist Paul R. Ehrlich. He points out that if the rest of the rapidly developing world actually adopts this American level of intensive consumption, our planet simply cannot sustain it. I mean, we would literally need another 4 or 5 Earths just to maintain that lifestyle globally.
Which brings us to a rather alarming number, 85. According to the Ecological Society of America, that is the massive number of countries currently living in what's called global overshoot. Basically, this means they are exceeding their own domestic biological capacities and having to actively deplete the material stocks of other nations, all just to keep their consumer economies running.
Because of this, critics across the entire spectrum, from economists to religious leaders like Pope Francis to writers like Jorge Masvidal, they all impartially argue that endless economic growth is on a fundamental collision course with our finite planetary resources. Masvidal actually puts it perfectly. Trying to fight environmental pollution without reducing our consumerism is exactly like trying to fight drug trafficking without actually addressing the drug addiction. The two things are completely inextricably linked.
Which leads us to our final section, part 4. Are there alternatives? How are people pushing back?
Right now, we're living in a culture of extreme duality. On one hand, you have the dizzying heights of hyperconsumption. Just picture those massive, frantic crowds of Black Friday shoppers storming the aisles. But right alongside it, you have active pushback. Think of things like the Buy Nothing Day protests, where people actively demand that we stop shopping and start living. Because while consumerism is incredibly deeply ingrained in our society, there really is a growing spectrum of alternatives out there. People are exploring everything from moderate approaches like simple living, eco-conscious shopping, or being a locavore and strictly buying local goods, all the way to much more extreme movements, like freeganism, for instance, where people actively reclaim discarded goods just to completely break out of that relentless cycle of excess. And it's not just grassroots movements doing this. The big academic frameworks are shifting too. Experts in a new discipline called ecological economics are actively trying to build entirely new macroeconomic systems. Their ultimate goal, to figure out exactly how we can balance basic human satisfaction with the very real, hard limits of long-term planetary survival, without always having to rely on infinite material growth. So we've seen how consumerism evolved from a 17th century luxury trade into something that completely defines modern global identity. And we've looked at the heavy environmental price it carries. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on next time you're about to tap your credit card. Are the things you own simply expressing your identity? Or, as the data strongly suggests, are they actually creating it? Thank you so much for joining me today to explore the evolution of desire.